So we're taking our time with the discussion of the progressive alternative in an American context. I devoted 3 classes to it. And today the main topic will be to return to European social democracy. Before we go on in the subsequent parts of the course to the other central themes of the economy, the state or democratic politics, and education. Next week's class I want to devote to the content of a progressive political economy, including all three themes that I regard as central: the relation of the backward parts of production to the advanced parts, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to production or to the real economy. But before I return today to European social democracy, the default position of the contemporary progressives, I want to give us a chance to discuss the final aspects of the American theme. And I remind you of the general plan of our discussion over those 3 classes. I began with an attempt to identify the salvageable element in the otherwise questionable idea of American exceptionalism. I discussed the message of the American prophets and the double taint on that message, the inadequate understanding of the relation of self-construction to solidarity, and what I called institutional idolatry. And then I developed a proposal in 5 axes. The first regarded the fiscal basis of the state and the relation of taxation to inequality. The second regarded the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy and the path from today's knowledge economy for the few to a knowledge economy for the many. The third theme was the development of education, the education required by a knowledge economy for the many and by an energized democracy. The fourth theme was the deepening of democracy and the institutional content of a high energy democracy. And the fifth theme was the basis of social cohesion or solidarity, and especially through the multiplication of forms of collective action outside the state and outside the market. And then the suggestion was that this programmatic orientation defined by the structural agenda that I've just recalled would represent then the correction of the American prophecy. It would do justice to the relation of solidarity to self-construction, and it would remove the exemption that Americans have accorded to their institutions from the reach of the experimentalist impulse. Any programmatic proposal, any ambitious programmatic proposal with an institutional content is the reverse side of a set of alliances, of social and political alliances. So any programmatic idea can always be formulated in a double register: the register of its institutional content and the register of the set of alliances that it presupposes. Every transformative project must build its own base over time rather than just relying on an antecedent base. Although, of course, the new base has to be built with the materials made available by the history of the society. And then we briefly discussed the general content of a transracial progressive majority in the United States, including its class content. But this discussion then evoked the two problems that I came to at the end of our American discussion, the wedge issues, the issues that tend to prevent or inhibit in the United States the formation of such a transracial progressive majority. And I identified two such issues. One, the way of relating race to class, and the other, the contest of moral agendas. So with respect to the relation of race to class, after having explored the main approaches to this incandescent theme in American history, I proposed a rejection of what is now the predominant approach in the United States, which is to treat race as a threshold issue prior to class. And I described the elements of an alternative approach. The alternative approach would begin by distinguishing the problem of individualized racial discrimination from the collective promotion of the disadvantaged. And it would understand racial stigma as an aggravating element in the circumstance of disadvantage. So the society must have a way of advancing the cause of those who are caught in a circumstance of exclusion and subjugation from which they cannot escape by the forms of collective political and economic action that are readily available to them. And so the essence of the suggestion was individualized racial discrimination should be criminalized, but the collective circumstance should be one that begins with class as the fundamental form of disadvantage and imagines that that source of disadvantage can be aggravated by any number of other circumstances, among which race. And as a preliminary to that second part of the proposal, I criticized the affirmative action idea as it exists in the United States as a characteristic example of the consequences of the threshold approach to the relation between race and class. Now, let me stop and ask whether you would like to have a discussion of this theme. Yes?
There is a clarifying question I wanted to ask from last week about your positive moral agenda point.
Yes, but before we get to that, let's just for the moment first focus on race and class, and then I'll come to the moral agendas. Now, it's not possible that this issue is not contentious because it is objectively in the United States very contentious. I made an argument against the so-called integrationist, that is the threshold approach. And I just remind you of what the argument was. So the argument said, First, it generates benefits in inverse proportion to the need for them. Its greatest achievement was to establish a black professional and business class. Those are the ones who were most benefited. The black working class, especially of public employees, is benefited less. And those who are benefited least, the ones who would need most, are the mass of underclass black workers who are caught in the secondary part of the labor market and fill the prisons. So there's something wrong with an approach to the problem of racial oppression that creates this inversion between benefit and need. The second objection is that it creates a situation in which the black leadership is separated from the rank and file and co-opted or conciliated in the established structure. And the third problem, and the one that's most relevant to the way in which I introduced this theme in our discussion, is that it offends the white working class majority of the country, which views itself as the victim of an alliance, of a conspiracy between the white elites and the leaders of the minorities. And that this fact, this interpretation, helps explain what has happened in the United States and the ascendancy of the right for many decades in the United States. That was the argument. And so the proposal was to rethink the relation between race and class. The last time in the United States that there was a consequential attempt to understand the relation between race and class in a different way and to act in this understanding was in the Reconstruction period. And the theorists of Reconstruction, that is the Reconstruction in the South in the years immediately following the Civil War. And now, I argued, a new Reconstruction is necessary adequately to deal with the problem of race in the United States. Now, how should the American progressives answer this criticism and this complaint? What should they say? Does the established view have no defenders? I can't believe it. James, do you want to speak for the established view? Uh-huh.
When I was trying to provoke our workers. One view I heard was maybe pushing back against your thesis on the significance of affirmative action for provoking white racial resentment among the working class. And kind of pushing back, well, how much does affirmative action...
Well, affirmative action per se, of course, is limited. It's an example of this larger approach. So maybe one shouldn't put that much weight on it. But because it's hard to take this idea that race should be treated separately and find other examples that are so tangible as affirmative action is. But the general theme transcends this particular instance of it, to be sure. So I think the real question, the underlying question is, should race be separated from class in this way or not? Or should race be combined with class in a way that allows us to address inescapable disadvantage wherever it exists, in whatever form it has, and then to provide a remedy for it, which is separate from the remedy, from the antidote to individualized racial discrimination. That was the main theme. And yes. Yes, I mean, so I could just as a footnote to what you're saying at that point. So clearly part of the idea is that if you have a policy that is addressed to the situation of the underclass that's in the unstable labor market, that is in the prisons and so forth, even if you don't mention race, it will automatically happen that a disproportionately large part of those will be members of the black underclass, the racially stigmatized underclass. Of course, then the problem of racial stigma poisons even more, gives an added edge to the disadvantage. Uh-huh. So just so I could elaborate your argument one step. The choice that Roosevelt made during the New Deal was to have social programs that would address the working class majority of the country, which in the United States are called the middle class. I think, what does the term middle class mean in the United States? It seems to mean something like a worker with a bourgeois identity, if we could use Marxist terms. But because white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, whatever, that's the so-called middle class. And Roosevelt's position, which is also the position of European social democracy, is that it is a mistake to single out a special class of poor people. Rather, one should have an expansive program that lifts the majority of workers up, and then the poor is part of it. rather than treating the poor as another insular minority in a coalition of minorities. Because if the poor are treated as an insular minority, then every time there's a downturn in the economic cycle or a change of the political winds, they will be turned off first. And the fundamental loyalties of the majority will not be to this program, to this social compact that benefits it, the majority. So this is the orthodox position of historical social democracy, as it was Roosevelt's position. And it can be contrasted, for example, to Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. Although Johnson was a disciple of Franklin Roosevelt, he adopted a position which was in fundamental disaccord with Roosevelt's. And I think you could say that the experience has vindicated the wisdom of Roosevelt's option over Johnson's. So you could make that kind of argument. And then you could say that this view that I'm proposing of connecting race and class suffers from that defect, because it then says we'll reach racial stigma through class disadvantage, but the presupposition of that seems to be to treat this class of the disadvantaged as, in effect, an insular minority. Yes. Yes.
How does that, once you build that into your conception, how do you sort of conceptually distinguish that from the integrationist affirmative action approach? Isn't the purest sort of form of your position that it shouldn't really matter at all except for that individualized?
No, I don't think so. I think the position would be unrealistic and even more unacceptable to the orthodox view if you were to deny that there's a distinct poisonous element that comes with race, and that therefore race has to be taken into account. Now, it is most poisonous when it takes the active form of racial discrimination. But then the question is, as a practical matter, can racial discrimination be sanctioned in and of itself as an evil in itself, and not simply as a trigger for a program of collective promotion? In many countries in the world, racial discrimination is a crime. And there's always the issue of the evidentiary base and so forth. But it happens all the time that people are put in jail in these countries because of racial discrimination. And so it's not impossible to develop a jurisprudence that identifies the indicia or the triggers of racial discrimination and sanctions it. So we can punish it. We can punish it separately from the structural evil. So I suppose one of the assumptions of this view is structural problems require structural solutions. And if there is a structural problem of disadvantage manifest in the existence of groups in society who are caught in a circumstance of exclusion from which they are unable to escape, then we have to have a structural solution to that problem. And we shouldn't confuse the structural solution with the punishment of the individual conduct of discrimination. That's the logic of it. Now, and that seems to me a very powerful idea. Yes?
I just had a sort of related but slightly different question. I'm thinking
Well, it's very complicated, right? Because, so for example, in Brazil, outside the south of the country, from the middle of the country up, everyone is more or less mixed race. So, under the American one-drop rule, one drop of black blood and you're black, everyone would be black. And of course, that's preposterous because they're still the elites. There's some element of miscegenation in their genetic background, but it doesn't count, as opposed to those who are really part of this racially stigmatized underclass. Now, it seems to me that one of the complications of the American situation, and this is something that came up in our very first class, the United States is is among all these advanced, rich democracies, the most unequal. Paradoxically, it is the one that is least disposed to regard itself as a class society. So there's the denial of class. It's supposed to be a classless society. In that speech in which Herbert Hoover accepted the nomination to run for president for the second time as his re-election, he says, we're not like Europe. In Europe, there are classes. In the United States, there are no classes. He's saying this in the middle of the Depression already. And there are no classes in the United States. We rise like free-floating atoms through the medium. So this is the American idea. Now, it seems to me that if you deny the reality of class in the way in which historically the Americans have been disposed to do, then it becomes somehow more natural to separate race from class, because race is something undeniable, it's visible, there's a history that comes from the fact of African slavery, and that can then be separated from class. Yes. Yes. I lost you somewhere there. So what are you saying?
The whole idea of how America is a classless society, that people can just sort of, rise from class to class.
Because that's related to this meritocratic ideal?
Right.
Yes?
And so this idea of meritocracy, or this idea that, there isn't some sort of broader system that's imposing poverty or sort of disproportionately imposing poverty on other people, does that also, in your opinion, affect the way that people see race?
Well, indirectly, because as I say, this denial of class has implications for race. So in these other societies of the Western Hemisphere, in which miscegenation is much more common, there's not a denial of class, but there is a denial of race. And so, and race and class fuse in a different way than the way that they fuse in the United States. So in the United States, race is very evident. Class is the substrate, but is denied. And in these other societies, it's the opposite in a way. That is, it's the racial element that is denied. And so they have a different problem, which they would have to face, of bringing it out into the open and then connecting race and class on different terms than the terms that the Americans have. But I wonder what the answer is to my first argument. That is, my first argument makes a very objective claim, which is that this threshold approach to race and class benefits most the ones who need the benefit least. And this is an objective problem, and it has to be solved on its own terms. So simply the promotion of the elites to the best jobs and the best schools is most obviously not going to solve the problem of the underclass. So it seems to me that's, isn't that undeniable? Yes.
I don't know. I used to be an organizer with PSA.
Uh-huh.
And PSA is very white. And at least where I, it's, no, it's probably everywhere. I don't know. I'm very qualified. But I'm from the Bay Area. Like at the point in which I was there, like there was a big push from the very small cohort of like people of color to try to bring Black and brown people into this movement of PSA, which is like, you know, something that brought Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to power, had a lot of local power
Uh-huh.
in my hometown. And there was a lot of resistance to it because people didn't want the organization to change, I think. And I think that, I mean, that's always a problem, right? Like when, you know, so it's the same reason that white supremacy hangs on, because like people are scared of change. And like the fact that integration doesn't just mean that you'll be with people of color, but that those people of color will have a voice that may shift the ideals of the things that they're a part of. And so I guess kind of to your like threshold thing, like yes, obviously, there's like there is a, and I missed the very beginning, so apologies if I'm understanding this incorrectly, but like there is obviously a unified need of the working class, but there's also this extreme division within the working class that do not allow for the changes that are necessary, because that would, a real working class movement would have to change to be integrated.
Yes. And so are you saying then that the organization of worker movements that are transracial is itself very difficult in the United States? And what is the way to address that problem?
I mean, I guess from my perspective, it takes like a mindset shift in the working class to understand their status. To your point, like to understand their status as working class as primary to their racial status, but also to understand their like understanding of the working class is missing pieces, right? Like they have to be open to an understanding that their working class experience is going to be different than that.
Yes. So there has to be the development of a class consciousness, which is, so it's like you have a balance, and what has to weigh on the other scale of this balance is this class consciousness. And that element is very weak historically in the United States. And it has to be developed through a structural understanding. I think that a very important element of class consciousness is this insight into the possibility of structural solutions to the structural problems. Because if you think that there's a particular set of initiatives that could change the situation, then it's much more likely that you would develop this class consciousness. That is, if it's simply a passive and fatalistic observation of a trait of the society, it doesn't become real in the same way or to the same extent. So that's a very significant aspect of this. Yes?
So American mass incarceration, to me, seems to be a system that targets people from racial minorities, but also tends to target members of the underclass who also happen to be members of those.
Yes, of course, yes.
There's tons of different ways to deal with rectify mass incarceration. Do you think that, at least in your program, those ways fall under the two programs that you've outlined so far, or is there maybe a third step?
Absolutely, absolutely, because I think mass incarceration is one of the fundamental problems of the country. It's a striking problem. And so the avoidance of mass incarceration, the rehabilitation of those who are its victims, is an example of the structural promotion. I would subsume that under the range of ways in which we would we would promote it. So it's not just the relation of the rearguard to the vanguard. It's not just a theme of political economy. There has to be then a distinct project to deal with mass incarceration. I agree with that. Although, of course, the details of that project are not clear. Yes?
When you're comparing the American approach to the mindset to the Latin American mindset, and you,
Yes.
I think apologies, I feel that in Latin America the racial part is denied or more invisible, and I think you referred to it as that's a different problem. Is that actually a problem in your, or is that not fundamentally what you're calling for?
Now, what do you mean? So I'm saying, there is a problem of massive racial discrimination in a society like Brazil, but it has a different aspect because it's much more diffused and subtle, and so there are these gradations of color that are associated with class, but differently in different regions of the country. And this complicated relation of class to race, but taking a different form from the form it takes in the United States. So then the fact that a person is a member of the plutocracy, but and has a whole European orientation, that is the cultural presentation comes to prevail over the genetic stereotype. And it presents the issue in a different way. But so it's still a society of the elite and the masses and these divisions, and the divisions are expressed in a different form. So I can't tell you which of these two is harder to address. It's a different problem. It's a different variation on the same theme. Yes.
I'm curious about what your view of reparations is, in particular the extent to which compensation or some sort of along racial lines accounting for episodes of injustice from slavery, but not just finance issues of property ownership. And I am interested in understanding the extent to which you think that constitutes structural institutional change versus kind of mere redistribution, or what would need to be true of it for it to move things forward structurally.
Well, I'm puzzled by the theme of reparations. I don't know what to think of it. So it seems to me that if reparations are understood by the logic of contractual restitution as a matter of what living individuals are owed today because someone else did something to them generations before, it's very hard to understand. But I suppose that reparations could be understood or could be expressed in a way which would make them part of these projects of structural promotion. So it would depend on the particular formulation, wouldn't it? What do you think?
I think kind of cutting a check to, a relatively small check to everyone who's black in America kind of is kind of episodic and is temporary. But I think investment in some of the institutions we've discussed, ranging from education to healthcare to
Of course.
in predominantly black communities.
Of course, that's a different story. That's a structural measure. So it seems to me reasonable to say in a society which in which part of the population was enslaved, and then the fact of enslavement has a long sequel of causal effects that refract throughout all of social life, then it's reasonable to say the society has a duty to invest, for example, in the schools of that part of the population that promotes its culture, that develops its ideas. But that I wouldn't see that by the logic of these individualized reparations. I would see that as the settlement of a collective obligation to the victimized part of that society. But that seems to me to be a different idea of reparation, right? It's not like your idea of a check to the individual members. That's superior, and it comes under the logic of structure.
How do you do that without being segregationist, though? Like, how do you, if you're saying that schools of that particular group of people, like that implies that those people are not part of the cultural system.
No, it doesn't. It wouldn't bother me, for example, if there are black schools, black colleges, universities that promote the history of the blacks. It wouldn't bother me that it's separate, because the question of whether they remain separate or not is for them to decide, and the issue is whether when they combine by their own desire, do they bring to the table the wealth of their cultural resources, and has the society helped them develop those resources that they would then bring to the table? I don't think that if they choose to be segregated in their own places, that's not an inherent evil. What's evil is if they're segregated but they can't escape the consequences of the past slavery. That seems to me the positive form of reparations.
I don't think so.
Well, say what you think.
I mean, I just think that like more segregation is like we have seen over and over that tends not to be the answer. Like obviously having existed.
No, I'm not saying it's the answer, but are you against the existence of separate black colleges?
No, but I think that the existence of a few black colleges is very different than saying black people will generally like all be kind of given a thing that is separate from the rest of people.
I think, but I think that the argument that I would want to have is whether this fact of remaining apart or not, like intermarriage or not, or endogamy, that can be a choice of the individual, and it can be associated with their ideas about their identity, about their future. I think that if the victimized group, the group that has been historically victimized, is given the resources to develop its historical memories, its legacy, it then makes a choice of how it wants to combine, how much it wants to combine or not. I don't see that as something that should be the object of social promotion. That is, integration of that kind in which you say the descendants of those victims cannot develop their own culture. Why not? I mean, it seems to me the more variety, the more difference, the better. So it's not difference that's the evil, right? It's difference that bears the stigma of a historical disadvantage. Yes. Yes.
Possibly as a solution to go somewhere to come in what you guys are saying.
Can you speak louder?
Possibly as a solution to find a medium between what you two are saying.
Yes.
Tommy Shelby, a Harvard professor in the philosophy department, has written on integration, and he's critiqued
Well, but let me clarify my idea. So I think, in general, in a democracy, the more difference, the better. And then the most important form of the most important mechanism for social cohesion, as I argued in that fifth axis of the American program, is the multiplication of forms of collective action. And forms of collective action among people who were different. So the most important differences are not the differences that we've inherited, to be sure. They're the differences that we will create. So prophecy should count for more than memory. But the problem is that if one of the partners is historically disadvantaged and is unable to bring to these combined forms of action the full range of their historical memory, their legacy, their culture, then there's a defect. And so what I would desire is that they be able to develop it, but they not remain just among themselves. They combine. That's the theme of integration that you mentioned. But ideally that they combine after having appropriated the historical legacy of their culture, rather than experience the combination as just a form of assimilation to the culture of their oppressor, of the elite. So I think that's what's at stake. Huh? It's not that the inherited difference is the point of arrival, it's just the point of departure. But it's important for it to be developed so that it can then be surpassed. That's the view that I would say. And I wouldn't see, so the ideal is not that the descendants of the enslaved group should live forever apart in some internal exile. The ideal is that they should combine, but they should combine after having recovered their unique resources, the resources of their identity, of their tradition. And that's then the sense of this logic of reparation, viewed in structural terms, to allow them to do that. That's what I would say. Now, what about the other theme, which is the theme of the culture war? And you were going to make a remark about that.
Yeah, so when I think about material concessions to the money class and moral concessions to the poor class and the whole culture war and everything, probably the first thing that comes to my mind, maybe this is just where I'm from, is like the moral majority organization, which, in case anyone doesn't know in the room, they were founded in 1979 by Jerry Falwell Jr. to pretty much radically oppose the acceptance of poor people in American society. There are like so many organizations like that, and so many I guess in terms of the culture war on the right, the kinds of moral debates are often things like that, like with queer rights, like the trans people deserve equal access to fair treatment in healthcare, and that sort of thing. And I don't want this to come off like sound like a loaded question, but I just mean like last week you mentioned that regarding the imposition of moral agendas on the right or left, American progressives should show restraint but keep the debate going. I just wanted to ask if there are any examples in the American context you could give of the moral agendas that should be continued being debated, but we should like show restraint in our discussions of.
You mean examples of this restraint?
Yeah, like when you say that we should show restraint when imposing moral agendas in progressive politics, like what kind of moral agendas do you think we should be more cautious about trying to fight and keep the debate going on?
So I think that if in a democracy there are these different moral and religious ideas, it shouldn't be the case that one group then attempts to entrench its form of moral consciousness and impose it on the others through federal law. That was the argument of what's happened in the United States. So the so-called secular or modernist moral agenda is imposed, is constitutionally entrenched in the United States, imposed by the federal courts, and then the white working class majority resists. There's the position of the white working class majority is reasonable. It says, these people who are in power have done nothing for us economically. Let's at least not let them offend our moral and religious beliefs. That was the argument. Yes.
Real quickly, I'm following the trend of what you're saying, but I'm curious, when you talk about the sort of moral values being instituted through federal law, that offend the sort of religious or social values of the white working class and make them feel alienated by the ruling class, what decisions, like, I'm not saying like list them all, but like, can you give some specific sense of what?
Well, of course. I mean, obviously, the most incandescent issue in the United States is abortion. So that's what puts the issue squarely. And they say abortion, freedom to do abortion is a constitutional right. A large part of the country rejects that. And now it's very complicated because what's the alternative? The alternative is to devolve that power to the states, to say the country has their different views. If you allowed freedom in the United States, if you reversed Roe versus Wade and you said there's freedom, what would happen? Different states in the Union would have different solutions. Now, does that mean that women who are in the non-permitting states would not be able to have abortions? No, it wouldn't mean that. They would have to travel to the other states. And the progressive forces in the United States would have to organize and finance their travel. Now, and that's very inconvenient. And there are dangers that could come with that. But you have to understand what's involved, that there's this war of moral agendas, that part of the country feels deeply offended by the imposition of the other moral agenda. And so there's a practical consequence. The practical consequence is to prevent, to help inhibit the formation of a progressive majority in the country. That's the practical consequence. Now, that's only one aspect of the argument, because there's a second aspect that I introduced, which was, now, if I believed that one of these moral agendas was decisively superior to the other, in religious terms, in moral terms, I might have a different conclusion. But as a matter of fact, I think they're both defective, morally. And so it seems to me to be in the interest of the American people not to stop the conflict or the conversation between them, but for the conflict to continue in the hope that the contest of these two moral agendas would in turn generate a deeper level of insight, of moral insight in the United States. Yes?
I want to try not to get bogged down in it, and perhaps also a better person to make these points would be someone with a personal stake in abortion rights. But first of all, the federal law allowing abortion, the court case allowing abortion hasn't stopped the contest of ideas currently happening in all the U.S. states. I'm not entirely on board with the idea that if we relax or the moral argument side of things, it would lessen the fervor
Sure.
I think that, like, I'm very hesitant to the idea that the first step of a progressive vision that elevates everyone is that we should try very hard not to offend the traditional values of the white working class, and in doing that, we should ask vulnerable people to give up essential rights for however long it takes for the progressive vision to realize. Like, I think there's a very good chance that if the progressive vision were realized nationally, um, it would help us all. But how long do we give up these moral, like these civil rights that were guaranteed to us through this moral conflict, in order to make that, in order to clear the way for progressivism? The same people who are against abortion are against stem cell research, and I would like
Are against?
the stem cell research, and I would like to be cured one day.
Uh-huh.
You know, the same people who are against more abortion are against gay marriage, and I would like to be able to marry a man potentially.
Yes.
I think that these things are not, they're passive moral, but they're also essential to the living condition of a great many Americans.
No, I understand.
I'm not convinced, like, there's a lot of cost to giving them up, and I'm not convinced there's a lot of benefit.
I understand this problem, but so let me compare it to the situation in my country. So we have now in Brazil something like 40 or 50 million evangelicals. And so we have a war of forms of moral consciousness in the country between the traditional Catholic population, which is much more tolerant of certain forms of moral difference, and these evangelicals. So what should be the attitude of the state? Now, it seems to me the attitude of the state should be some significant degree of self-restraint in the legalization and constitutional entrenchment of these conflicting moral agendas. That's the point. And of course, there's a limit when one of the moral agendas creates physical danger or a risk to the integrity and the cure of people and so forth. So we have to judge those limits. But so I see what your argument is. I see the force of your argument. But we have to take into account this other element. Yes. Yes.
On the other side of that coin, and on the sort of more positive side, isn't the moral majority question a really good example of how actually the effect hasn't been as you described? Because I don't know the situation perfectly, but certainly in my own country, for instance, the progress on homophobia and transphobia has been incredible in one generation.
Uh-huh.
So that kind of progressive leadership actually has worked in that case. And surely to some extent that's visible in the US as well.
So, and therefore what? So I think the activity of persuasion is certainly fundamental. This moral pedagogy, this enlightenment. The question is, at what point and to what extent should one of the visions in conflict be entrenched as law and imposed on the other? That's where the self-restraint is necessary. Yes.
My concern is you can't really ever restrain entrenching a moral order. I think that all key political concepts derive from the secularization of the life. For example, the concept of dignity
Yes.
right espoused in society as a culture.
Yes.
And so it seems to me we basically just have to pick a particular moral creed to entrench that we can have a reasonable amount of agreement upon. In some cases, and sometimes as progressives we just can't see them because they're too important to us. So for example, I believe, following Simone de Beauvoir, that for women to be free, they have to be able to transcend biological limits, such as needing
for liberation of?
Half the people, roughly half the people in this country.
So your comment then invites us to go back a step to the principles of liberal thinking, and of course, one of the basic principles of liberal political theory is that an institutional order, an order of right, the system of right, should be neutral among sectarian visions of the good. And this is as you suggested just now in your remark, this is a false idea, because no institutional order, no order of right, can be neutral among the visions of the good. Every institutional order tilts the scales towards one direction or another, encourages some forms of experience and discourages others. And you could say further then that this idea of neutrality in practice is an instrument of its opposite, because it entrenches a certain regime and then insulates it against attack, claiming that it's neutral. Nevertheless, now, and this is then the other side of the argument, the illegitimate and unrealistic idea of neutrality has a kinship to another ideal which is legitimate and even indispensable, that the order of right in a democracy, although it cannot be neutral among visions of the good, should be open to a wide range of contradictory forms of life. And more important, it should be corrigible. That is, it should be susceptible to transformation, to correction. And so the combination of contradiction with corrigibility, I want to say, is the legitimate substitute for the illegitimate idea of neutrality. So what all of that suggests is that in a democracy there should be a wide range of contradictory moral ideas, and within limits imposed by the necessity to preserve the physical integrity and safety of the citizens, there must be restraint in the members of the society who temporarily exercise power, then imposing their moral vision through the law on all the others. That's the simple point. Yes.
I feel like we should talk about the fact that I don't view it as an imposition of a moral view, because it's not as though Roe v. Wade is the Supreme Court saying abortion is a nation and everyone should get one. Roe v. Wade is the Supreme Court saying the federal government has no right to unreasonably burden a woman who's seeking an abortion. It was not about what side of the moral pro-choice, pro-life
Uh-huh.
right on the side of the federal government. It was about the domain of government and what freedom they have to restrict our liberty. And I think, honestly, the weird thing is that, like, that framing is the sort of framing that the rail against abortion should get on board with. Because, I don't see they put on a moral bet because they allow people to engage in behaviors that some people find morally objectionable, but it's not as though the civil rights decisions of the Warren Court or the Roe v. Wade decision were the federal government saying there's a culture war in America, and the liberal side of the culture war is definitely so it's just them saying you have certain rights, and you can have whatever beliefs you want, and you can't impose those beliefs on other people to the extent that you define them.
Yes. Yes, I see all of that. But I don't see why that negates the general problem that I was presenting, that there should be some self-restraint in the legal imposition of a contested moral view. That's all. The question is, what are the limits? And you're quite right in in saying that there are these limits of physical integrity, safety, and so forth.
I guess my point is that, like, I don't see it as an imposition of a moral view. I see it as only a rights thing. Those beliefs can pass as the federal government being on the side.
Yeah, well, there I don't follow you, because there I think where the rights language is being used, in fact, to express one of these sectarian moral views. It's simply a discourse, a language. It's a rhetoric. What you're describing as an idea of a right is, in fact, the legal manifestation of a moral idea, whether it's a right or not. And that's always going to happen. That's the problem with the idea of neutrality. So rights talk always presents a contested moral view as if it were just an impersonal right that has nothing to do with moral views. That's the problem with this liberal theory. Yes?
I just really articulate myself very well when I ask my question initially. I think what I'm trying to say is that our definitions of a moral agenda are different. To take an example of, like, the state where I grew up, Kentucky, the majority of the state, I could go into a restaurant and they could say, we don't serve people like you, get out of here. And there's a legal right to do that.
Uh-huh.
Because there's no nationwide or statewide maybe a strong moral agenda in saying that I think that's what it is.
Of course, that relates to our other problem of discrimination and the criminalization of discrimination. So I'm not against the criminalization of discrimination.
That's something like the Equality Act, like nationwide. But that to me, that sounds like something that you might describe as imposing a moral agenda. Morals that gay people should be allowed to possess. So it would depend on what.
No. Of course, one has to start making differences here. But I think that the refusal to transport or to serve people who have a certain aspect or a certain thing, that is discrimination. So, and discrimination you can prohibit and even criminalize. So I don't see that as in contradiction to this idea. I think the notion is that in a democracy, people will have a wide range of substantive views, and they will feel intensely about them, and there must be self-restraint in imposing those views through the law. But I don't see that as from that resulting an invitation to discrimination. In public places, in public arenas, everyone has to be served, everyone has to be transported, and it's not an acceptable moral view then that this factional attitude can be translated into a refusal to serve or to transport. That's the limit.
Political questions I've always had growing up, the moral questions are, race largely is a moral question. There's a lot of white Americans in the South that at least, I guess all over the country, but especially more conservative areas, they believe that it's a moral issue that, like reparations, even the discussion of reparations would be considered like a moral agenda that's completely unacceptable and parents allowing their kids to have like hormone blockers if they're trans. Like that kind of stuff is what is framed as a moral agenda in my context. So there's conversations here that really make sense to me. I just wasn't sure what kind of moral agenda abortion or queer rights or any of that sort of thing. I'm not sure what kind of moral agendas there are you're talking about that we should show restraint.
The disposition to live a certain kind of life, and that the translation of morality into the arrangements of the society. So there's no clear-cut line, as you're point about discrimination shows. But that doesn't mean that there are no lines. And so the objective is that there should be this wide coexistence of contradictory views, and that are limited in their ability to impose themselves on the other. And then you have to ask, what are the limits? And the limits have to do with these questions like ability to control one's own emotions, physical integrity, safety, and so forth. Yes. Well, the old example from 100 years ago was prohibition. Alcohol.
But have there been any, say, in the last 30 years where all these other transformations we're talking about?
I think homosexuality would be an example, and I think that's another case because it shouldn't be, obviously it shouldn't be suppressed, it shouldn't be prohibited, and it's inherently contentious. So.
Why is it inherently?
Well, it's inherently contentious in the sense that there are strongly held religious views on one side or the other, and you're either going to prohibit it or going to allow it, right? It's like there's no space between the yes and the no. So that's a case in which we can't allow the suppression of the conduct, homosexuality, because it results in discrimination against a category of citizens, in which their whole identity is negated, their form of life. And so the affirmation of one vision of how to live cannot result in the suppression of another form of life.
But I suppose no one's heterosexuality is being suppressed by the enshrining of the legal right to, for example, gay marriage.
That's right. No, I agree with you. No one is being. It's not being suppressed, but the person has to have the ability to develop their form of life, to affirm it in the way they live, in the way they connect with other people, and not to receive the objection that that's incompatible with someone else's view of how to live. So that would be an imposition through the law of a single sectarian view on the others. So these limits are going to these limits are always going to exist, and the question, but don't you all think that in the end there is still this problem that I mentioned, that a significant part of the country feels offended in its moral sensibilities? That was the problem of the moral concessions to the moneyless classes, and are receiving nothing economically. So that then inhibits the formation of a progressive majority in the country. Yes.
You might have already addressed this, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating it, but in what we discussed before about the line between protecting rights and imposing some sort of legal position, from an implementation perspective, maybe you might have discussed this, but what body or what entity decides what
I think that the idea is that the public officials, the public institutions, should not be the moral tutors of the nation. And the president of the republic should not be a kind of moral censor that tells people how to live. And that the society should be organized in a way that allows these different moral visions to continue being affirmed. So long as by being affirmed in the conduct of some of the citizens, it's not denied in the conduct of the others. And there can never be complete neutrality for the reasons that we discussed, but there has to be this self-restraint. And if there isn't this self-restraint, if there's an attempt to use the instrumentality of the law to impose the views of part of the population on the other, morality, in moral terms, there will be the kind of problem there is in the United States. So I think that's the practical consequence of this. Yes, and then we're going to go on in the discussion. Yes. Yes.
In my estimation, there may be some sort of anti-class consciousness that's emerged in the country out of kind of probably the Cold War, where discussions of class were equated with communistic Soviet ideas, and being American equates to kind of free market capitalist, classless discussions and so on. How do we kind of combat maybe the entrenched view that class discussions of class are kind of out of the scope of American public discourse and life, and change, and essentially how do you kind of shift culture, shift consciousness towards class?
Well, but there can't be, right? I mean, how can you deal with the structural realities and not be able to talk about class? So, and even in the United States, it's not as if class consciousness didn't exist at all. It does exist, but it is repressed, it is denied in certain ways. It has paradoxical implications for the United States because the denial of class has made it easier for Americans to cooperate across class lines that they don't see. I think that's one of the reasons why cooperative practices are so developed in the United States. So I think it's paradoxical, but the way in which you would make it patent is by having a debate about the structural alternatives to it, because you see as natural what you view as having no alternative. And once you for example, so just take this fact that's been a theme now in our discussions. There's a vanguard, there's a productive vanguard, and everyone who is outside this vanguard is condemned to some form of make-work. Around the vanguard, there are a bunch of paper pushers, management consultants, financiers, and so forth, who are parasitic on the vanguard. But everyone else is condemned to some form of make-work. So those are the kinds of economic realities from which class structures result. And once they become the object of a struggle in the country, class consciousness arises. So what I would say in answering your question is, how does class consciousness come to be an object of awareness? Through a contest over the arrangements that produce class is the answer. That's the way in which it happens. It doesn't happen by passive insight. unrelated to transformative initiative. Yes. What? What? I was, but you have a question. Yeah?
In a political context where there is a strong progressive moral consciousness about these issues that are talked about in terms of rights, whether it's reproductive rights or gay rights,
Yes.
when there's strong progressive moral consciousness and a weak progressive class consciousness, are there not enormous political risks for any progressive movement to try and shift the attention away from these moral issues to these class issues?
I think so. So the problem is the structural poverty of the existing agenda, right? And that has to be changed. So the whole argument in this course is about what the content of such a structural agenda would be. And the claim that I just made in response to your colleague is that the way in which you would change that is by addressing the structural conditions that produce the realities of class, and which are invisible. So the relation of labor to capital, the relation of finance to production, the relation of the backward parts of the production system to the advanced parts, and so forth. Then there's a debate over structure. Now, I think that these moral beliefs that we've been discussing for much of the class today would begin to change in a society in which there was a live struggle over the transformation of the structural arrangements. Because, for example, a characteristic of some of these progressive moral beliefs is that they speak to a kind of moral individualism which already presupposes the denial or suppression of the structural alternatives. In a society in which there's a high energy democracy, there's a knowledge economy for the many, the basis of this moral individualism also begins to shift. And that's, I think, the most promising way in which this conflict of moral agendas would start to change. Okay, so now let me go on back for a moment to the default position of the progressives. We've had these three classes about the United States. But the default position of the progressives in the contemporary world is European social democracy. And I want now to recapture the steps of my previous discussion of European social democracy. How are we to understand what social democracy or social liberalism is? So it's, in a sense, a bargain, a settlement, a compromise. The forces that attempted to reshape production and power renounced their challenge, and in return, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate the economy more intensively, to attenuate inequalities through retrospective compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, and to manage the economy counter-cyclically through fiscal and monetary policy. If we have an unsentimental, realistic view of social democracy, we can see it as composed of a series of institutional arrangements. First, there were the arrangements that protected insiders against outsiders. The organized minority of the labor force against the disorganized majority. The incumbents in the market for corporate control against the challengers. And small business against big business. So there were a set of arrangements in historical social democracy that protected the insiders against the outsiders and limited the extent to which the insiders were subject to insecurity in the product markets, in the capital markets, and in the market for corporate control. Now then there was a second set of arrangements that consisted in deals between organized labor and big business orchestrated by the national government. These deals were called incomes policies or social compacts. And their aim was to organize the distribution of the benefits and costs of alternative macroeconomic policies so that there could be a basic consensus among the dominant organized interests of the society rather than unresolved conflict. The third set of arrangements that has defined the historical agenda of social democracy is the maintenance of a high level of redistributive social entitlements used to invest in people and in their physical and educational endowments, but paradoxically financed by the indirect and regressive taxation of consumption. So, a high social contract of entitlements and a reliance on regressive taxation, like the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax or its functional equivalents. Now, what has happened historically to social democracy? What is the fundamental movement? The fundamental movement is that social democracy has given up the first two sets of arrangements, the safeguards for insiders against outsiders, or for incumbents and established workers against economic insecurity, and the incomes policies or social contracts. It has given them up, and it has retreated to the third set of arrangements, the maintenance of a high level of social entitlements financed by the regressive taxation of consumption. Now, why has it retreated? So, first let's understand this as a function of the arguments rather than of causal factors. So, there's an argument about inefficiency. All these arrangements of social democracy, these safeguards against insecurity, these protections for insiders were viewed as being inefficient. And second, there's an argument of fairness. These were all dualistic arrangements that divided, that separated the insiders from the outsiders, the incumbents from the challengers. And unfair, therefore. But the most important reasons for this retreat of social democracy have to do with objective transformations. So first, the crisis and decline of conventional industry, of traditional mass production, what we call Fordist mass production, and the appearance on the world labor market of hundreds of millions of less well-paid Chinese and Indian workers. Second, the vast migratory flows within Europe itself, degrading the ethnic and cultural homogeneity on which historical social democracy relied. And then third, the worldwide competition enshrined in the established form of globalization and the threat that it posed to these established insiders in the European social democracies. So the historical base of the social democratic parties was organized labor headquartered in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, and especially in conventional industry. And as in the United States, the whole middle part of the job structure, reliant on this inherited economic world, began to sink and collapse. So then social democracy retreats to the last line of defense. The last line of defense is the maintenance of high social entitlements financed by the regressive taxation of consumption. And there is a hollowing out of the inherited institutional core of social democracy. So social democracy is then liberalized. And the dominant project of the North Atlantic elites, the elites of the North Atlantic industrial democracies, becomes to reconcile the social protection of the Europeans of historical social democracy with the economic flexibility of the Americans. Now let me give you a characteristic instance of this liberalized, hollowed out social democracy. It's what is called in the Scandinavian countries and in the Netherlands, for example, flex security. So it's the development of a package of protections, like protections against unemployment, that are not dependent on the possession of any particular job and that are portable among jobs. So the idea is the insecurity of labor increases, the traditional protections of labor are diminished, but in return, the individual worker citizen acquires a series of safeguards that don't depend on possessing any particular job and that are transferable among jobs. Now, what is the fundamental problem? What is the challenge to social democracy? The challenge is that there are a series of structural problems that cannot be addressed within the terms of the historical compromise of social democracy or of this new liberalized form of social democracy. What are those problems? So to my mind, the most fundamental problems are three. The first is the problem of the hierarchical segmentation of the production system between vanguards and rearguards, especially under the conditions of the new most advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy. So there is a vanguard. The vanguard is multi-sectoral. It exists in every part of the economy, but in each part of the economy it exists only as an exclusive fringe that excludes the vast majority of workers and of firms. The second problem is the problem of social cohesion. What is the basis of social cohesion and social democracy? It is money transfers organized by the state against the background of a high level of ethnic and cultural homogeneity. When there is an intensification of migratory flows and the level of ethnic and cultural homogeneity erodes, the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes manifest. And the dispositions, the culture that promotes this acceptance of a high level of social entitlements begins to disintegrate. The third structural problem is the difficulty of promoting structural change, including change that addresses those two problems I just discussed, the hierarchical segmentation of the economy and the subversion of the basis of social cohesion within the present form of democracy, the low energy form of democracy. These are democracies that rest on a low level of political mobilization, of popular engagement in political life, that perpetuate impasse and that make it difficult to combine strong central initiative with radical devolution. As a result, they are democracies that continue to make change depend on crisis. These are the problems that cannot be addressed or much less resolved within the limits of the social democratic compromise or of its new liberalized, hollowed out version. So the basic argument I'm making is that the ability to address these problems would require these societies to reopen the terms of the historical compromise of social democracy. And in particular, to reopen the terms under which it renounced, it abdicated any attempt to reshape the worlds of production and of power. Now, there are two problems that are just on the limit, the boundary between what this social democracy can do and what it cannot do. So one problem is the provision of public services. This is the main topic of electoral politics in all of these societies. And the limits of what in an earlier class I called administrative Fordism. So the characteristic way of providing public services remains administrative Fordism, the provision of standardized, low-quality public services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And the only alternative to administrative Fordism seems to be the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. So that would then require the state to be able to help organize civil society so that civil society, acting through cooperatives of health providers or educators, could partner with it, the state, in the experimental and competitive provision of public services, not for profit. So that's just barely on the horizon of what is visible and feasible in this liberalized social democracy. The other problem, which is frequently invoked in the politics of these societies and is just barely accessible, is the financialization of the economy. So the extent to which finance uses the transactions of the real economy as a pretext rather than its real objects, and fails to serve the productive agenda of society. Venture capital is minuscule as a proportion of the activities of the capital markets. And the most important financial activity, which would be the financing of the creation of new assets in new ways, in fact occupies a tiny portion of the activity of the financial markets. Now, if we step back now and try to achieve a larger view of the limitations of social democracy, of what it does and does not accomplish, we could say the following. The whole emphasis of social democracy has been on protection against economic insecurity. So the individual is to be secured in a haven of safeguards against economic insecurity as well as public oppression, and of endowment assuring capabilities. Capability ensuring endowments, I should say. The emphasis of social democracy is on this haven. And the newest form of the haven is the flex security that I described. But why do we have this haven? So we have the haven so that there can be a storm of innovation, of creation, of production. And social democracy appears to be a form of politics, of political economy, that is concerned solely with the haven and not with the storm. It has no productivist agenda. Its agenda is to humanize the established economic forms, but not to transform them. So there's no progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. And more generally, there's no larger vision of creation, of innovation, of production, of transformation. And that explains what I think is then a very general feature of the situation of the progressives throughout the world. They are the theoreticians of an antidote to economic insecurity. But they bring no message of creation, of production, of innovation. And this is a losing position in politics. Because then the progressives are condemned to being the humanizers of the inevitable. And their project at the end of the day is the project of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. So that's one way of stating what the central problem is. there's a fundamental difference between a political project in which the purpose of the haven is to allow the individual worker and citizen to stand up and thrive in the storm, and a politics that has no view of the storm. Its only view is of the haven. Now, we can also translate this into the terms of the discussion with which I began the course. So, what is the method? To what extent does social democracy imagine that we can pursue our interests and ideals beyond the boundaries of the established institutional arrangements? And to what extent does it take that boundary, that as the insurpassable horizon of our present political possibilities? So, viewed by this criterion for the distinction between the progressives and the conservatives, the right and the left, social democracy is on the conservative side. It continues to take the established institutional arrangements as the horizon. And then we can ask, with respect to the goal, to the aim, the very basic question: is it natural for human life to be small? And again, the answer seems to be that for historical social democracy, it is considered natural for the life of the ordinary man and woman to be small, except when there are the great national emergencies of war. And then some form of sacrificial devotion allows us to escape from our belittlement. So social democracy, in both its classical form and its latter-day, hollowed out, liberalized, modernized form, brings no message of how we can ascend together, how we can become bigger together, how we can rise to a higher form of life with greater capabilities, greater intensity, larger scope. It is the combination of the acceptance of the established institutional order with this idea of the naturalness of our belittlement. Now, I'm saying, and this then is the point of this whole argument about historical social democracy. It is a kind of belittlement. It's an abdication. That's the default position of the progressives throughout the world. That's the problem. That this position, which in fact is a retreat, a submission, is the official position of the progressives throughout the world. So that's a subject I want to begin the next class on, and we'll devote a little bit of time to that, and then go on to the broader agenda of a progressive political economy. So, James, I found that discussion of the United States